Welcome to the Chapter 6 video presentation of crime scene investigation as we take a look at establishing identity. Cicero said the first duty of a man is the seeking after and the investigation of truth. So for this particular chapter, we'll do these objectives, 3 types of prints and how they can identify an individual. Those types will carry forward into some other types of evidence. 3 determinations that can be established from the analysis of prints. How fingerprints are formed, early identification system, 3 patterns that are used in the classification of fingerprints, proper lighting method used to find prints that are not visible in natural light, 3 different types of fingerprints, latent fingerprints and development methods, what APHIS is. We'll talk about patent fingerprints, proper packaging of evidence with possible latent fingerprints, and what the term elimination fingerprint. We'll talk about the evidentiary value of prints from gloves, 2 characteristics of handwriting examination, 2 questions that we can answer through handwriting investigation, question document collection, exemplar writings, and the 2 types. And we will actually not talk about the identification of human remains. We'll talk about that later and combine that with Chapter 16. Alright, the following types of prints can identify an individual, and we focus a lot upon fingerprints. That's the common method that we discuss quite frequently because fingerprints are on file. So we typically take fingerprints of individuals who are arrested for crimes, but we do not typically take footprints and do not typically take palm prints either. So that's why fingerprints have kind of rose to the top. People normally touch things with their fingers unexposed, but they don't with their feet. But footprints are just as unique as fingerprints are. We just don't have a big database to compare them to. So fingerprint experts can make these determinations. They can say with almost certainty that a subject made a particular print. They can also say there's no way that this person made this print. Of course, you have to have the print and also a known comparison print. So you have to know where your comparison print came from. You have to be able to testify, we know that this came from John Doe. And the final thing that happens more than people probably know is that there's just not enough detail to evaluate the print correctly. You have to have sufficient detail to make a determination, and that happens a lot. If you look at your fingers, you'll see the patterns on them if you look closely. Pardon me, and those are friction ridges. And the purpose of a friction ridge is actually to help an individual grasp onto things. You can imagine if you had slick skin on your hands and fingers, it'd be more difficult to hold things. So friction ridges serve a dual purpose there. And what fingerprints are formed from are what you've touched throughout the day or perspiration that is formed on your fingers throughout the day. And that's what leaves a nice print for us to collect. And so whatever you touch, dirt, blood, grease, and some of it is more visible than others. And we'll talk about that in a minute. If you get blood on your fingers and you touch something, it leaves a quite visible print. But some are not quite visible, and you have to use processing techniques to make them appear. But also, if you think about clay or Play-Doh or some sort of pliable surface, you could even say paint that is not completely dry, so you can leave a negative or backwards impression into an object that can be useful in an investigation as well. Early potters used to mark their pottery with fingerprints to indicate who made the pot. You also have these forerunners, Galton, Henry, and Jennings, who helped move fingerprinting forward. Jennings wrote a book that is still used today to help identify the different fingerprint patterns, which we'll talk about: loops, arches, and whorls. In France, it's always been in the world, that is, but this started in France. It's always been an effort to try to identify individuals, and we still see that today. But we have more advanced techniques such as fingerprinting and DNA. But way back in the 1800s, it was very difficult because they didn't have the science and technology to make these determinations. So they did things such as made body measurements, and Alphonse Bertillon was the one who proposed that you could take measurements of certain parts of an individual's skeletal frame and their body and use those to determine if you had the right individual in custody. It kind of slipped away when some different errors were made. Will West was a famous case in Leavenworth Penitentiary that you might look up and see how these two individuals who are pictured here had extremely similar body measurements. In fact, they look somewhat similar too. Their fingerprints were completely different though, and that's how they figured out they had two different people, and one person was claiming to be the other, and it was not accurate. And fingerprints were what John Dillinger made efforts to change his fingerprints. He actually took acid to them and did all sorts of things, but even so, they were able to identify positively John Dillinger after his death. He was set up, of course, by the lady in red, who was pictured here, who actually did not wear red that night. But they visited a theater, and the officers caught him leaving the theater, and a shootout ensued. Dillinger was killed, and they positively identified he was the man through fingerprints, despite his efforts to conceal. Fingerprint patterns include the arch, the loop, and the whorl. And you can see the arch is simply an arch pattern. It does not circle back into itself. And that's the primary difference between an arch pattern and other patterns. Whereas you see the loop, it's a single loop. It's not a circle. It's still sort of an arch, but it loops back into itself. It's less of a mountain than it is a circle of sorts, but it is not as prominent as a whorl, which is actual easy to identify circles. So the loop looks more like a paperclip, and the whorl looks more like a circle. So arches, loops, and whorls are three patterns. The primary patterns are not the three types of prints, so don't get that confused, but they're three types of patterns that you see in prints. And you can look at your own fingers, take a magnifying glass to them, and you can probably see arches, loops, and present. So, an example of where fingerprints may come in handy, and it's not just homicides and burglaries. You may look for fingerprints and points of entry where you know the suspect came in, locks, broken windows, any broken piece of glass, anywhere that you know they may have touched, including light switches to turn a light on, or light bulbs that are loosened. It's common if they want to conceal their entry and it's at night, they will loosen a light bulb in order to turn the light off. They may use the bathroom. You may check there if there's a flashlight left at the scene, or even the batteries inside the flashlight. It is possible in some cases, although somewhat difficult, to get a print off of the inside of a latex glove. If they used a glove at the scene and then took it off and tossed it before they left, any sort of smooth surface, and the smoother the surface, the easier it is going to be to collect a print. That's very important. You have to have a pretty smooth surface to get it off of. The rougher it is, the harder it is. For example, if you look at some automobile dashboards, you'll see the texture is kind of rough actually and not completely smooth, and therefore may present some difficulties in trying to collect a fingerprint. Doesn't mean you shouldn't give it a shot, it just may present some difficulties. Oblique lighting is what we use to find latent prints, and we'll talk about what latent prints are. They're difficult to see with the naked eye, and you can see an example in this picture here. You hold the light at an angle, or actually put it across the surface of a smooth surface, and when you do that, you'll see all sorts of things pop up, including dust and even print patterns. May not be just fingerprints, could be fingerprints. So the three types of prints, and this is what you should remember, are plastic, patent, and latent prints. And we talk about each type here. Latent fingerprints are the most difficult to see with the naked eye. Sometimes you can see them with oblique lighting, but it just takes a little effort to do so. And sometimes you can't see them at all. But latent prints are found by the perspiration or grease or whatever that you've touched that's not really necessarily visible, but it leaves a film perhaps, and when you touch a surface, it's going to leave an impression again that you can't readily see with the naked eye. Specialists are trained to develop latent prints, but really anyone can. We train all of our police officers to process latent prints because all it really takes is a powder and a brush applied to that surface, and usually you can get a latent print developed. Powders, and if I don't, I'll go back to that slide with patent or latent, patent, and plastic prints and explain all three if they don't come up here. But development techniques depends upon the surface that you are applying it to and the type of print that you're developing. So if you have a black surface, a lighter colored print powder may work better. If you have a light surface, good old standard black powder works pretty well for that. And there are other types of magnetic powders, fluorescent powders. So again, really depends upon what you are trying to work with. Different types of brushes, including fiberglass, animal hair, and natural fiber. The very important thing to remember here too, so jot this one down, is that you always photograph a print before you attempt to lift it. So if you process it with powder, a nice print displays, take a photo of it. And the reason that we do this is because it's somewhat easy to mess up a print by trying to lift it. Essentially, you're applying tape to the print to preserve it and then applying that tape to a card. Well, if you've ever worked with tape trying to wrap Christmas presents or something like that, you know how often or how easy it is for that tape to fold over upon itself. And before you know it, you have a big mess. Well, the same thing can happen with lifting a print too. So if you take a photo, at least you have something that the fingerprint examiner may be able to work with that photo. Here's an example of Magnum brush or fluorescent powders. So on a dark surface or a dark area, or they may have tried to clean up a surface. You can make it glow, so you can see how a photograph would be nice in this case too to make a comparison. Lots of detail. Other types: DFO, fluorescence, and gentian or crystal violet. Uh, some of these play upon the proteins in the body too that secrete and make a print too, and they react with those proteins to expose the print. Ninhydrin is along those same lines too. It's very similar, to kyanacrylate fuming, which we'll talk about here in a minute, which is basically superglue fuming. Essentially, they stick again to the proteins that are left upon the surface of particularly firearms. This works with really well, exposes them. You don't have to remember all those different approaches, just kind of showing you some examples. Physical developer is actually a film developing process when we used to take pictures by film and develop them, and they still do that. PD, it can be used for fingerprints as well. Silver nitrate, SBR, or small particle. Sudan black, in combination with a vacuum metal deposit chamber or a vacuum chamber, you can put Sudan black, put an object into the chamber, and again it will attach to the surface. It's very helpful with rough surface objects like concrete. They've been able to develop some fingerprints off rough surfaces through this method by putting the object into the chamber along with Sudan black, and it develops because again it attaches to what is on the fingerprint. So here is an example of a very rudimentary and basic super glue chamber where you simply hang the object, in this case a handgun, in the chamber and seal it off, and you heat up super glue, and the super glue actually puts off fumes and vapors and reattaches to fingerprints that are left on the gun. And what it does is it leaves a nice white fingerprint to examine. It works really well with guns because they have lots of smooth surfaces except for the hand grips, and they're black, so the white really displays nicely. They make professional chambers like this too, but you don't need something that extraordinary. You just have to make a chamber and heat up the lasers and alternative light sources, similar to the oblique lighting, it just applies a different type of light to a surface, and sometimes it makes those fingerprints really pop. And once you locate those prints, this is really helpful in locating it. Once you locate it, then you can develop it further with one of the techniques we described, and you'll have more and more. What we're seeing is fingerprints are not taken by ink, they're taken on computer displays. So essentially, people who get arrested are taken into custody, and they are fingerprinted on platens. Basically, their fingers are rolled and a computer takes an image of their print. So when you have a print that you collected at a scene, you can compare it to the computer prints on file. Very difficult to remember all the methods that we just described. So what the crime scene investigators have at their disposal is, if they're presented with an object that they think may have a good fingerprint on it, they can consult these charts that say what the best approach is to use. So if it's a porous surface, you see here a dry surface, it recommends using paper. If it's a paper surface, using DFO, anhydrine, or silver nitrate. If it's a glossy surface paper, it recommends a powder brush or a superglue fuming. You can see if it's a wet surface, it says season dry followed by PD. So it just depends, and non-porous is on the right hand side. So these charts kind of make it easier to process. There have been some attempts to remove one's fingerprints and replace them with someone else, and this was actually at a border crossing where they caught an individual who had done this. He had tried to take fingerprints off another individual and apply them, and we assume that individual is deceased, and apply them to his own fingers. And it's kind of gross looking, an interesting method. APHIS is simply the computer identification system that is run by the Federal Bureau of Investigation, and most states have their own APHIS link as well. APHIS is set up to make those computer comparisons to collected fingerprints. So APHIS is sophisticated enough to compare different points on a fingerprint to the print that you have and make the match to a print that has been collected by somebody that has been arrested. Now, that's the important thing. If an individual has never been arrested and their fingerprints have never been entered into the APHIS system, they won't be there and there will be no match. Obviously, you are not fingerprinted at birth, and those are kept on file. That does not occur. It's simply people who have been arrested who those comparisons are made to. So you can see there has to be a certain number of points that have to be met, and APHIS always has to be verified. So a human being has to pull up that APHIS hit, is what we call it, and they have to look upon it with their own eyes, an expert, and say for certain that yes, what we have here is a match. APHIS does not make matches on its own that can be taken to court, and we say, well, APHIS said it was. It has to be a fingerprint expert to make that determination. APHIS was able to convict the Night Stalker. This individual would commonly break into homes in California and rape the woman of the house and kill the man of the house. Sometimes he'd wait to kill the man of the house after he had raped the woman. He would disable the man, and just a terrible individual. But APHIS actually connected. One woman survived and saw him take off in a car, which ended up being a stolen vehicle. They found the stolen vehicle and they fingerprinted it, and they found this individual's fingerprint in the car on the mirror and connected it through APHIS. So it's a very powerful. Real quick, I'll go back to what is a patent print and a plastic print. A patent print is one that is visible to the naked eye because of the substrate of what was on the individual's finger. So blood is a good example of a patent print. An individual gets blood on his hands and touches something, and you see it clearly when you show up at a crime scene. It's like, wow, there's a fingerprint in blood on the wall. That is a patent print as opposed to a latent print. Finally, a plastic print is an applicable surface. So that would be, again, going back to the clay or the Play-Doh or the paint, something where you can make a negative impression by pressing your finger into it. Silly putty, whatever it may be. That is a plastic print, very visible. Preserving prints, I go back to the fact that you should photograph them first, whether they're latent, patent, or plastic. Take a picture because if you mess up the collection, it will be preserved anyway, and also it shows the jury where you recover that print, so you can actually show them a picture of where it was. You can take that picture with and without ruler scales to show the size, or you should, with and without to show the size if need be, and you may remove the ruler to show the jury. If visible without development, it should be first. Always photograph first. Plastic prints, if it's hardened, so if it is clay and it hardened, you may just take the whole thing. But regardless, photograph the print. There's no development necessarily if you can just recover it. You may be able to, in some cases, use a mold if you don't think you can recover it. But if at all possible, even if it's a paint, a plastic print and paint, you might consider cutting that area out and taking it with you. Lifting with tape is the most common method. Photograph it first as always. The goal is to prevent air pockets, so you brush it with powder. You take a piece of tape, which is kind of a large piece of tape, probably inch and a half to 2 inches wide. You place it down on the powder print and you lift it, and then you put it on a white card, which we call a fingerprint card, and that becomes your piece of evidence. So just like any, if you imagine putting tape on a Christmas present, again, sometimes you get bubbles or creases. We try to avoid that. If you have a print that doesn't look like it's a full fingerprint, there might be a temptation to say, well, there's not enough detail there to make a comparison. Let's leave it. But you should collect those. We should always collect those. The fingerprint expert will make that determination later, because even partial prints sometimes reveal enough detail to make a match. Again, plastic prints, it depends upon the life of an object. So if you have a fingerprint in butter, obviously that's a very that print could be perishable. It could melt and it'll be gone. Clay is probably around forever, so the lifespan is going to depend upon the surface. Foreign material prints, it depends upon that substrate that got on the fingers too. So soot, flour, face powder, short-lived, but blood lasts a long time. Ink and oil, they last quite a while when we're talking about patent prints. Now, latent prints, they can actually last for years. So it's not uncommon to see latent prints 4 or 5 years old make the difference in the case. Temperature when we're developing prints, and often I relate to cars. We'll find cars in the middle of winter, it's 10 degrees out. It is not a good idea to try to fingerprint in 10-degree conditions. We try to move that car into a normal environment like a garage and let it thaw to room temperature before we try to attempt to process it. And that's because there's more moisture in the air, and that can destroy the print. Prints on skin is tough to do, but it is possible. It is extremely tough to do. Some of the methods are chroma coat, which is similar to photograph paper, that they hold it on a body and they develop it for 5 seconds or so and hold on the body. Another method is that super glue fuming. They can actually make a chamber, put it over a body, and that may work as well, but it's very tough. Now, palm prints, the problem with those again is they're not collected as much as fingerprints, but they can identify the suspect. So if you see a palm print at a scene, you should collect it. If we get a suspect later, we can take their palm prints and compare them. Footprints are the same way. Not collected as a matter of routine, but they should be collected at a scene they're found. Packaging prints, the whole idea is we don't want to rub the print off. So you don't wrap it in paper cloth or put it in a plastic bag. We try to wedge it into some sort of box or something so we can preserve that print. So when it gets to the lab, they can process it. It's important that we don't get the packaging surface to rub against that print. Elimination print. So at a burglary scene at your house, you would expect to find your fingerprints all over the place. So it's not uncommon for the police to ask you, can you come in? We'd like to collect your prints so we can eliminate the ones that we found at the scene as belonging to you and not waste our time trying to compare them to a suspect. So it would include you or anyone else who's in the house. So basically, anyone with legitimate access should have their fingerprints collected to eliminate them as a possible glove print. Some gloves, if you find a print from a glove and it's obvious it's from a glove, well, we should collect them because you may find gloves on a suspect where you can make a comparison. There may be certain points that are unique to that glove. Gloves may also become contaminated, as you can see. Fabric gloves are tougher. Leather gloves may be very helpful, especially if they have in them. Real quickly, we'll talk about handwriting investigation. There's two different types: your style that you use and your personal characteristics. So you may use cursive, you may use block handwriting. That's your style, but your personal touches are you may form your B's in a certain way, or your D's or your T's. They all may have personal characteristics. Albert Osborne was kind of the early 20th century person who really dug into handwriting examination in his book Question Documents. Osborne's text is still used today as a definitive publication on handwriting examination. So the things that we can answer: was the signature a forgery? So did it belong to the individual or not? Or were the two writings made by the same person? That's what we're trying to answer in handwriting examinations. You can imagine some of the types of things are checks. Not many people write checks anymore, but they exist. Credit card receipts that you have to sign, money orders, suicide notes, life insurance policies, all sorts of things could have a handwriting uh, to examine for a criminal case. Recovering documents to be potentially looked at by a handwriting expert later. We try not to handle them too much. The more you handle any piece of evidence, including documents, the more you have the potential to alter it. Clear plastic envelopes work pretty well for those. Air dry and any wet documents. So if they have some sort of something was spilled on them or something like that, we air dry them before we package them so they don't develop mold or something like that. Forceps are helpful because you also want to think about fingerprints. There could be a fingerprint on a document that you want to recover too. You see in the movies sometimes where an individual rubs the side of a pencil along indentations in paper, and we simply don't do that. There's other methods that are more effective at doing that, such as alternative lighting that can be used in the lab to do that. Photograph the document prior to applying chemical processes. In the lab. We always take photos of everything before we basically handle it because we can mess it up in the course of trying to process it. Sometimes we see writings on walls, desktops, and mirrors that should be photographed with and without scale. I had a sergeant I know who responded to a homicide of a woman. A man had amassed a bunch of gambling debts and he killed his wife to try to get her life insurance money, but she started to write his name on the wall in her own blood before she died. So that became a very important piece of evidence in that case. Store documents in a cool, dry area away from the heat and sunlight. Exemplar writings is when we bring an individual in to get a collection of their handwriting to compare to a writing that we have that is a piece of evidence. We do informal and formal. Informal meaning it's a writing that we know that they wrote, like a check that they've deposited in their account. And a formal writing is where we sit them down and we ask them to write certain phrases for us that we may compare to, say, for instance, a threat note at a bank robbery that they pass to a teller.